The thing about being called a failure is that after a while, it stops hurting, and it simply becomes white noise, background chatter, just another part of family gatherings. At least that's what I told myself as I walked up to my parents' house for our annual Thanksgiving dinner. I am Katherine Bennett, though my family calls me Kathy, usually with a slight shake of the head as if my very name is a disappointment. The designer coat I wore cost more than their mortgage, but I had deliberately chosen something plain and unassuming because there was no need to tip my hand just yet. My sister Diana's voice carried from the front door as she announced to everyone that the family failure had finally graced them with her presence. I smiled tightly, remembering the stack of papers waiting on my office desk because Diana had no idea how prophetic today would be or how everything was about to change. Inside the house was full of the usual suspects, like Uncle Peter, who ran Bennett Manufacturing with my father, and Aunt Margaret, who never missed a chance to compare Diana's success to my supposed failures. My cousins James and Laura were there too, both middle managers at the family company and both convinced they were destined for greatness. My mother kissed my cheek and immediately asked why I couldn't have worn something nicer for Thanksgiving. I thought about the 3 luxury boutiques I owned in Manhattan, but I just told her this was all I had. She sighed and mentioned that at least I came, though. Diana told her I was still doing that little online thing selling clothes or something. Before I could even respond, Diana swooped in her diamond bracelet, catching the light, and corrected my mother, saying I resold designer stuff like a thrift shop, but online. Diana turned to me with fake concern and asked how making ends meet was going for me lately. If she only knew that her beloved Bennett Manufacturing had been secretly hemorrhaging money for months, and that their suppliers were abandoning them. If she only knew that bankruptcy was just hours away, and that my little online thing was actually Eclipse Luxury Group, which was one of the largest high-end retail conglomerates in the country. But she didn't know, and none of them did so. I just quietly said that I get by while accepting a glass of wine from my father. He declared that getting by isn't the Bennett way, and puffed up with pride, while pointing out that Diana was the youngest VP in company history. He told me to look at James and Laura rising through the ranks and called that real success. I took a sip of wine to hide my smile because the Bennett way had led their company straight into the ground while they were busy promoting family members and ignoring market changes. Diana practically bounced with excitement as she told everyone the big news, that Bennett Manufacturing was opening 3 new facilities next year, and that Daddy was talking about taking the company public. I nearly choked on my wine because they were planning an expansion when they could barely make payroll, and when their debt was about to come due. I managed to say that sounded ambitious, but Uncle Peter chimed in saying I wouldn't understand because business strategy isn't really my thing. The room erupted in knowing laughter at poor Kathy, who couldn't handle the family business, and who walked away 5 years ago when they offered her a job in the mailroom to learn the basics. My mother called everyone to the dining room announcing that the turkey was ready, and we filed into the formal space where name cards marked our places in the family hierarchy. Diana sat at my father's right hand, of course, while I was placed between Cousin Laura and Aunt Margaret as far from the head of the table as possible. Aunt Margaret began her interrogation as we passed the turkey, asking if I had considered getting a real job, and mentioning with fake sympathy that she heard Walmart was hiring. Laughter filled the room again while I calmly cut into my turkey, remembering the day 5 years ago when they tried to demote me to the mailroom. At that time, I had just finished my MBA and was working in acquisitions, bringing my father solid proposals for modernizing the company. But Uncle Peter had convinced him I wasn't ready for real responsibility. He claimed the mailroom would teach me humility, and that was when I walked away, selling my shares back to the family for a fraction of their worth. Those shares would be worthless by morning, but I took that money and invested in a small but promising luxury retail platform called Eclipse. Now, Eclipse Luxury Group owned 30 high-end boutiques and 6 online retail platforms, and we were about to acquire our first manufacturing company. I set down my fork and said I had been meaning to talk to everyone about business, but my mother sighed, asking me not to start this again. Diana smirked, reminding everyone how well my last business advice worked out, and asked if that Eclipse company I loved so much had been bought out recently. I nodded and confirmed it was bought by Morgan Holdings, while Diana turned to our father, thanking God they didn't listen to my investment advice. My phone buzzed again in my pocket, and this time I took it out, making a show of checking the message under my father's annoyed gaze as he asked if there was some crisis at my little resale shop. I said no, and told him calmly that I was just confirming that Bennett Manufacturing's bankruptcy filing had been accepted by the court. The room went completely silent and Diana's fork clattered onto her plate, while my father's voice went dangerously quiet, asking what I had just said. I chewed a bite of turkey slowly before responding that their Chapter 11 filing was just approved, though given their debt load, it would likely convert to a full liquidation under Chapter 7 very quickly. Uncle Peter stammered, shouting that this was impossible and asking how I would even know, but I just smiled at their pale faces. I mentioned that I forgot to tell them that Morgan Holdings, the company that bought Eclipse, is my holding company, and I own it just like I now own all of Bennett Manufacturing's debt. The silence that followed my announcement was deafening, and you could have heard a pin drop in that dining room, where just moments ago they had all been laughing at my expense. My father's face had gone chalk white, and Diana's mouth hung open as her perfectly applied lipstick suddenly looked garish against her pale skin. Uncle Peter finally sputtered that I was lying and that this was some sort of sick joke, but I simply reached into my bag, which was the cheap bag they had been sneering at all evening. I pulled out a thick folder and told them that actually I had the paperwork right here, including the bankruptcy filing and the debt acquisition records. I spread the documents on the table right next to the cranberry sauce and pointed to the page listing the creditors, where it showed that Morgan Holdings owned 82% of their outstanding debt. Diana whispered that it was impossible because I only ran a small online resale shop. I couldn't help but laugh and asked if that was what they really thought I had been doing for the past 5 years, while they were busy mocking my little online thing. I explained that I had built Eclipse Luxury Group into a $3.2 billion company, and that Morgan Holdings, my private investment firm, was worth even more. Cousin Laura choked on her wine at the mention of $3 billion, while I shrugged and said it had been a good quarter. My father finally found his voice, though it shook with barely controlled rage, as he asked why I would do this to my own family. I set down my wine glass carefully and asked if he meant the family that tried to demote me to the mailroom after I finished my MBA. I reminded them of how they laughed at every suggestion I made to modernize the company, and how they called me a failure at every single holiday. Just then my phone buzzed again, right on schedule, and I stood up saying I needed to take the call because it was likely my assistant with the final paperwork. I walked into the hallway, leaving them to stew in their shock, while I heard their panicked whispers through the dining room door. They were telling each other I had to be bluffing and urging my father to check the company accounts or call the lawyers. I smiled as I answered my phone, and Jennifer confirmed that everything was ready and the offer for asset acquisition was prepared. I told her to give it 5 minutes to let them digest the news before sending in the team. When I returned to the dining room, they were huddled around Uncle Peter's phone, frantically checking account balances and legal notices. I asked pleasantly if we should discuss the next steps since my team would be here shortly with the acquisition proposals. My mother's voice was faint as she asked what team I was talking about, but right on cue, the doorbell rang. I checked my watch and noted they were right on time as my lawyers and financial advisors entered the foyer. I told my family I hoped they didn't mind if they joined us for dessert, because we had quite a bit to discuss now. My father stood up trying to reclaim some authority, and shouted that I couldn't just come in here and do this, but I cut him off immediately. I told him his company was bankrupt, and he had defaulted on $142 million in loans that I now owned. I explained he had exactly 2 choices, which were to work with me on an orderly restructuring and sale, or I would force a total liquidation first thing Monday morning. Diana started crying as her mascara ran down her face, and she wailed about the expansion plans and the new facilities they had promised. I finished her sentence for her and told her those plans were never going to happen, because the company had been insolvent for months. I asked if none of them actually read the financial reports, or if they were just too busy promoting family members and planning parties to notice they were hemorrhaging money. Jennifer led my team into the dining room, where 3 lawyers and 2 financial advisors all carried briefcases full of documents. The contrast between their professional demeanor and my family's shell-shocked expressions was almost comical. One of the lawyers nodded to me and asked if we should begin the formal review. I gestured to the dessert plates my mother had laid out and told them to help themselves to some pumpkin pie while we worked, since my mother's recipe is quite good. For the next 2 hours, we went through the details of Bennett Manufacturing's collapse and my proposed acquisition. I had spent months planning this by buying up their debt through various subsidiaries and watching as they dug themselves deeper into trouble. Uncle Peter admitted grudgingly that the work was thorough, and I smiled, telling him that unlike some people, I actually understand business strategy. By the time we finished reviewing the documents, my family's empire had effectively crumbled to dust, while mine had grown even larger. I had given them terms that were fair, but left no doubt about who was in charge now. As my team packed up their briefcases, I looked directly at Diana, James, and Laura. I told them very clearly to clean out their offices by Monday morning, because their positions were being eliminated in the restructuring. Diana shrieked at me, asking how I could fire my own family, but I corrected her calmly. I told her I wasn't firing family, I was firing underqualified executives who got their jobs through nepotism. I stood up and smoothed my dress, telling her that if it made her feel better, I heard Walmart was still hiring. My mother looked like she was seeing a stranger for the first time, while my father sat slumped in his chair, staring at the remains of the turkey. I thanked my mother for dinner and told her the turkey was excellent, even though we didn't get to finish it due to the business discussion. My father's voice stopped me at the door, asking if this was all just about revenge. I turned back to look at all of them and told him no. This was about debt and business, but the revenge was a pleasant bonus. Walking out to my car, I heard Diana wailing inside about her mortgage and her country club membership, and all the things she was about to lose. James was yelling about lawyers and fighting back, but they had nothing left to fight with, because I owned the very ground they stood on. I got into my car, which was not the modest sedan they thought I drove, but a Mercedes S-Class I had delivered specifically for this moment. As I pulled away from the curb, I saw them all standing at the window, watching me leave, like ghosts in their own home. My phone buzzed one last time with a message from Jennifer, stating that the acquisition announcement was ready for Monday morning. I smiled, thinking about how different next Thanksgiving would be, and wondered if they would still call me the family failure when I owned their company. I wondered if they would still mock my little online thing when they were all standing in the unemployment line. I drove back to the city feeling a sense of closure that had been 5 years in the making, while the Bennett name prepared to fade into the shadow of the eclipse. 1 week later, Bennett Manufacturing's name was officially changed to Eclipse Manufacturing, becoming the newest subsidiary of my growing empire. I kept the company's original logo, which had been designed by my grandfather, but I added one small detail, which was a tiny eclipse symbol as a permanent reminder of how the family failure had eclipsed them all. I sat in my new executive office, which used to belong to my father, and looked at the family portraits still hanging on the wall. I didn't feel the need to take them down because they were just relics of a management style that had failed to evolve. The transition was brutal for the rest of the family because they had built their entire identities around their titles. Diana eventually found work at a department store, and while it wasn't Walmart, it was close enough to be a humbling experience for someone who used to call herself a vice president. James and Laura had to leave the state entirely to find jobs, because their resumes were tainted by the collapse of the family business, and no one in the local industry wanted to hire people who had helped run a company into the ground. They were finally learning what it felt like to be judged on their merits rather than their last name. Uncle Peter retired in shame after the forensic audit revealed just how many personal expenses he had been charging to the company accounts over the years. I chose not to press charges because seeing him lose his status in the community was a far more effective punishment than a court case. My father tried to reach out to me about a month after the acquisition and left a voicemail that started with him admitting he was wrong about me. However, the message ended with a request for a job as a consultant because he couldn't figure out how to live on his reduced pension. I had my assistant send him the same form letter we send to all unsuccessful applicants, stating that his qualifications did not meet the needs of the restructured organization. It felt cold, but it was the same clinical dismissal they had given my ideas for 5 years. They had taught me that business was about numbers and results, so I was simply playing by their rules. As I looked out over the city, I realized that the heavy weight I had carried since that mailroom offer was finally gone, and I was no longer the girl seeking their approval. The following Thanksgiving arrived, and for the first time in my life, I did not attend the family dinner at my parents' house. Instead, I was in my penthouse office overseeing the final integration of another manufacturing firm we had acquired over the summer. My assistant Jennifer brought me a glass of champagne. As we watched the city lights flicker below us, I thought about my mother and father sitting at that same formal dining table, probably staring at the empty chair where the family failure used to sit. I wondered if they were still passing the turkey and talking about real jobs, or if the silence in that house had become as heavy as the debt they used to carry. I decided to send them each a gift that morning, but it wasn't the kind of gift they expected from a wealthy daughter. I sent them each a high-quality leather-bound notebook with the Eclipse Manufacturing logo embossed on the cover. Inside, I wrote a short note that said I hoped they were enjoying their real jobs and were thankful for all the lessons they taught me about business and humility. I knew it was a jagged pill for them to swallow, but they had spent decades feeding me the same bitterness. I wanted them to look at that logo every day and remember that the girl they tried to bury was the one who ended up owning the shovel. My father sent me a text message later that evening that simply said, "Happy Thanksgiving, Katherine," without using the name Kathy for the first time in years. It was a small concession of respect, but it came far too late to mend the bridge he had burned. I realized then that I didn't hate them anymore because hate requires an emotional investment that they no longer deserved. They were just former business associates who had failed to perform, and I had moved on to much larger markets. My phone buzzed with a notification that our international sales had hit a new record, and I turned back to my spreadsheets, leaving the ghost of my family in the past. The local news had run a story earlier that week about the revitalization of the old Bennett plant. Under the Eclipse banner, they interviewed some of the floor workers who said the new management actually listened to their ideas, and that the company felt stable for the first time in a decade. That was the real victory for me, because it proved that my MBA and my modern strategies weren't just theories. I had saved the jobs of 300 people that my father and Uncle Peter were willing to sacrifice just to maintain their country club memberships. I sipped my champagne and felt a genuine sense of peace knowing that the Bennett legacy was finally in competent hands. By the time the new year rolled around, the name Bennett was nothing more than a footnote in the local business archives. I had successfully integrated every department of the old company into Eclipse Manufacturing, and the efficiency ratings were higher than they had ever been in my father's era. I decided to host a corporate gala to celebrate the first quarter of the merger, and I invited the entire board along with our top-performing floor managers. As I stood on the stage looking out at a sea of professionals who respected my vision, I realized that I had finally built the family I actually wanted. It was a family built on competence and mutual respect, rather than bloodlines and belittlement. A few days after the gala, I received a package in the mail from my mother containing an old photo of me as a child sitting at my father's desk with a plastic briefcase. There was no note included, but the message was clear enough, and it felt like a white flag of surrender from a woman who had spent years watching her husband and daughter go to war. I placed the photo on my bookshelf next to my MBA and my first acquisition contract. I didn't feel the need to call her or thank her because we both knew that the girl in that photo had finally grown up to take the desk for real. The power dynamic had shifted so completely that there was simply nothing left to say between us. Sometimes success is the best revenge, but I realized that the true victory was the freedom to never think about their opinions again. I had spent so many years of my life measuring my worth against their insults that I almost forgot how to measure it by my own achievements. Now, as I signed off on a multi-million-dollar expansion into the European market, I didn't wonder what Uncle Peter would think or if Diana would find it ambitious. I simply did it because it was the right move for the company I had built from the ground up while they were busy trying to bury me. As I closed my laptop for the evening and looked out over the skyline, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction that had nothing to do with the billions of dollars in the bank. It was the knowledge that the family failure had become the family nightmare, and then finally just a stranger they used to know. I poured myself one last glass of wine and toasted to the empty room and to the little online thing that had changed the world. Sometimes karma comes with a side of pumpkin pie, but for me it came with a seat at the head of every table I chose to sit at.